Welcome to the Explainer. So, let's just jump right into this. When you hear the words the Mongol Empire, what instantly pops into your head? Probably a pretty fearsome reputation, right? A relentless, unstoppable force on horseback just sweeping across the map. Well, today, we are going to look at a massive historical plot twist. Because the Mongols weren't just conquerors. They were actually the architects of one of the greatest economic shifts in human history.
Section 1. Beyond the Bloody Conquest. Get ready to challenge everything you thought you knew about 13th century Eurasia. Now look, we have to acknowledge the grim reality of this early expansion first. Conquest, horsemen, fallen cities. Genghis Khan's expansion, which really kicked into high gear around 1206, was extraordinarily violent. Entire political systems just disappeared overnight. Populations suffered catastrophic losses. The sheer scale of the destruction as they pushed into China, Persia, Russia, and Eastern Europe was staggering, and we absolutely cannot ignore that brutal reality.
But here is where it gets interesting. The expectation is usually this horde of unstoppable warlords, right? But the reality is a massive historical bait and switch. Their most lasting achievement wasn't actually war at all. It was taking this giant fractured collection of distant, completely isolated markets and turning them into something much closer to a single unified commercial network. They were, in essence, master networkers.
To really understand how they pulled this off, you have to look at the conditions back then. The pre-Genghis Eurasian steppe was incredibly divided. It was super dangerous. If you were a merchant trying to make a living, you faced bandits, constantly shifting borders, and just unpredictable tolls at every turn. But the sheer violence of the Mongol conquest accidentally solved this massive business problem. By wiping out all those fractured borders, they created what's known as the Pax Mongolica, or the Mongol Peace. Suddenly, almost overnight, long-distance trade was unified and, more importantly, secure.
Chapter 2. Building the Mongol Highway.
Once you conquer all that land, you have to figure out how to actually run the thing. How in the world do you govern an empire that stretches for thousands of miles? It's an absolute administrative nightmare. You can't just conquer a territory and leave. You have to be able to communicate across it.
Well, their solution was something called the YAM. It was this massive, sprawling system of relay stations built for rapid imperial communication and travel. This infrastructure quickly became the absolute backbone of the empire. It allowed government officials to coordinate, but crucially, it also allowed merchants to safely access these sprawling, continent-spanning routes.
And the brilliance of the YAM system was literally just in its simplicity. Picture this: a rider arrives at a station, immediately swaps to a fresh horse, and just takes off again rapidly to the next post. It exponentially increased the speed of travel across the entire empire. Information could suddenly move at a pace that was entirely unprecedented in human history.
And this speed, it completely revolutionized trade. Faster information meant merchants knew exactly which routes were safe at any given moment. You knew where markets existed, what the current prices were, and who actually controlled what territory. Having that fast information directly removed the uncertainty and friction that had usually held merchants back for centuries.
Chapter 3. The Eurasian Information Network.
Let's talk about what was actually moving along these newly secured hyper-fast trade routes. When we think of the Silk Road, we instantly think of, silk and maybe some spices. But this network moved so much more than that. We're talking about the knowledge of gunpowder moving westward, papermaking and printing crossing massive cultural boundaries, medical ideas and complex astronomical data traveling between vastly different civilizations. The physical trade network literally became a massive information highway for human progress.
And it wasn't just goods and ideas moving around, it was people. The Mongol Empire was incredibly diverse. It acted as this melting pot of global expertise. You had Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, Tengri worshippers. They all lived across its territories. And the Mongols were surprisingly tolerant of different religions, largely because they were practical. They realized that running a vast global economy required all sorts of diverse specialists. They heavily relied on this international network to handle complex things like taxation, agriculture, and finance.
The sheer scale of this connected world just completely blew people's minds back then. Take this quote: "Marco Polo introduced European audiences to descriptions of an enormous and wealthy Asian world." Now sure, historians still debate some of the exact details of his journey, but the broader reality is undeniable. European merchants could finally travel much deeper into Asia, and the unbelievable stories of wealth and scale they brought back, that changed the European worldview forever.
Chapter 4. Financing the Global Empire.
Now, an information and trade network this big doesn't just run on good vibes alone. It requires serious financial innovation.
You can almost think of the Mongol leaders as the venture capitalists of the steppe. They fundamentally understood that to make real money, merchants needed capital, they needed lines of credit, they needed business partnerships, and above all, they needed safe ways to transfer their wealth across thousands and thousands of miles.
Which brings us to one of the most remarkable innovations of the era, particularly under Kublai Khan over in the Yuan dynasty of China. Just imagine the absolute shock a merchant would feel. You travel thousands of miles to get there, and instead of lugging around heavy metal coins to do your business, you're told to trade them in for state-backed paper money.
So let's break down this paper money experiment. Obviously, paper is vastly easier to transport, which is fantastic if you're a traveling merchant, but it demanded absolute trust in the state. And as anyone who studies economics knows, it was highly vulnerable to overissuance. Eventually, they printed way too much, and that excessive issuance contributed to severe inflation in Yuan China. So it was a brilliant, yet ultimately quite fragile financial system.
But hey, the economy was much bigger than just China. The empire was divided into distinct, massive regions. You had the Golden Horde in the west, Chagatai in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Yuan dynasty in the east. And even though these were completely distinct political regions, for a long time the ruling families managed to stay connected through the larger imperial system. These robust commercial links between the regions fueled an absolute economic boom across all of Eurasia.
Chapter 5: Fragmentation and Lasting Legacy. Because, as we know, all empires, no matter how hyperconnected they are, eventually face the darker side of their own success. So, let's trace the timeline of how it fell apart. The network first began to unravel due to political fragmentation. Rival khanates started fighting, and those famously safe routes became a lot less secure. But then, look at the 14th century, the Black Death. This right here reveals the truly tragic vulnerability of globalization. The exact same hyper-connected trade routes that moved silk, spices, and ideas also moved disease, with absolutely devastating consequences for the world. But here's the thing. Those commercial connections didn't just vanish from people's memories. Centuries later, Europe's desperation to reconnect with those wealthy Asian markets directly sparked the Age of Exploration.
If there is one profound lesson the Mongols learned, and that we should probably take away from this explainer, it's this. Conquest creates territory, but trade creates wealth. The most successful Mongol rulers realized that territory was pretty much useless without merchants moving, markets functioning, and information flowing freely.
Today, we tend to think of globalization as a strictly modern invention, right? We think of giant container ships, satellites beaming data, the internet. But the Mongols achieved the exact same core principles of globalization, connecting far-flung markets, reducing friction, aggressively protecting trade, moving information rapidly, and building trust. And they did it all using nothing but horses, relay stations, and immense political willpower.
Which leaves us with this final, fascinating question to chew on. The Mongols dominated their world through bloody conquest, sure, but their true, lasting legacy was what traveled down their roads long after the armies had passed. If an empire built on horseback accidentally created an early version of globalization, what hidden networks, what surprising connections are we building today that will end up defining our future? Definitely something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.